The story begins with Tori and Kyle Breyer as they try to conceive a child. We see a number of books on shelves saying this, just they appear to be ineffective. Their wish seems to come true when a spaceship crashes in the woods and the couple discovers a mystery infant boy given the name Brandon. We then see a video of a child, Brandon, as he grows up. Tori is playing hide-and-seek with the slightly younger Brandon after watching some of these clips. Brandon is then at school, answering to a question asked by the teacher. This attracts the attention of a young classmate called Caitlin. Back at the farm that night, as Tori paints, Brandon sleepwalks to the basement and discovers a meteor, most likely the one that brought him to Earth. As he approaches, he chants angrily. Tori tries to calm him down. Brandon gets up the next morning and goes to mow the lawn. He flings the mower a few hundred feet, frustrated with trying to start it. He moves over to observe the blade spinning on it. Curious, he thrusts his hand into it, stopping it cold without leaving a scratch. Later, Tori, Kyle, his aunt Marilee, and his uncle Noah join a diner. When Noah tries to offer him a toy gun, Kyle chastises him. Brandon, on the other hand, insisted on having a gun. With that, the family leaves in the middle of their celebration, with a waitress watching as they go. The next morning, Brandon isn't even listening to Kyle. He notices Brandon biting on a fork without causing any damage to his teeth. Kyle takes Brandon hunting, showing him his rifle and talking about how his body is changing since Tori discovered some lingerie advertisement beneath his bed. Later that night, Brandon is pursuing Caitlin while listening to slow rock music. She detects the music coming from her laptop and closes it. However, she is concerned that he is watching her from a nearby window. Suddenly, her mother, the waitress from earlier, enters, asking what's wrong. She starts breathing nervously. Back at the farm, Noah and Tori are searching for Brandon. They find him. Tori talks with Brandon's instructor at school the next day while he draws some strange pictures in his notebook. Tori asks about them. After that he closes it and walks away. Back at the farm, Kyle sees Brandon frightening some chicks. He asks if he's okay, to which he says yes. Then, the two go inside. Tori and Kyle later go outside and discover that all of the chickens have been slaughtered. Tori believes it was a wolf, but Kyle believes it was Brandon, who was out earlier. The next day at school, Brandon and his classmates participate in a trust fall exercise. Caitlin feels nervous about what happened the other night but says nothing. However, he falls to the ground as one of his classmates fails to catch him. He is fine, but Caitlin says she will not hate him since he is a pervert. Brandon says it is a lunch. The coach makes her help him up. But he grabs her hand and abruptly breaks it, sending her screaming. Tori is then at the office, explaining to Caitlin's mother that he apologizes and that accidents happen. However, the mother is not convinced. She requests that the sheriff arrest him, but he declines. Instead, he will attend special school sessions. Meanwhile, Brandon just sits there, sad, as they continue to argue. Tori defends him, despite the mother's claim that he was born to a psychopath. Brandon looks her a threatening stare before they go. Later that night, Kyle and Tori are talking about him. Tori then researches meteors, but then notices something in the barn. Brandon is experiencing a glow, which could be caused by the meteor. She rushes out to check on him, only to discover him levitating in the barn. He continues to chant, "Take the world," as she approaches. He falls and cuts his hand on a meteorite. She goes down to recover and persuade him to back down. He freaks out and explains how he came from the sky, then yells that she lied to him and flees. She goes and tells Kyle what he found with the meteorite. Brandon, enraged as he walks, shouts and releases lasers from his eyes. Later, he pays a visit to Caitlin in her bedroom, where she is typing with one good hand on her laptop. He tells her not to be afraid, and that she understands how unique he is. She says her mother told her not to talk to him, but he says he's gonna take care of that. She cries as he suddenly leaves, leaving behind a flower for her. Meanwhile, her mother is about to close the diner when she notices something is wrong. She steps out and notices diagrams on the windows, identical to those drawn by Brandon in his book. The lights start to flicker, then the windows break and the mother takes a piece of glass out of her eye. She looks around, but she knows someone is there, so she grabs a baseball bat, only to see a shadow figure fly by quickly. She swings, hit nothing, and then runs to the cooler in the back, locking the door. As she rushes for cover, Brandon uses his laser vision to burn through the door, tearing it off and giving her a menacing look before charging and probably killing her. Brandon meets up with his parents the next morning, informing them that everything is good as explained. Back in the diner, a sheriff and his deputy investigate what happened, including the remains of her body. The sheriff locates one of Brandon's diagrams on the glass. Merrily, who is also a psychotherapist, tries to speak with Brandon, but he is unable to describe what is going on. The session goes nowhere, and Merrily considers reporting his actions to the police. Later, at a pub, Kyle discusses what happened to Caitlin's hand with his buddies, and he begins to suspect his son is a monster. Tori is back at home, working in the bathroom as the lights flicker on and off. Later, Brandon arrives at Merrily's place and expresses a want to speak with her. He advises against speaking to the police since it is not good for anyone. She tells him to go home, and he apparently does. But later, he stands outside her window, watching her text Noah. He returns to the house in his costume, but Noah discovers him in the closet. He escorts him out, threatening to inform his parents. They begin to load into Noah's truck, and as he tries to force Brandon into it, he is slammed against the garage door. He gets up and drives away in his pickup, scared, but he knows Brandon is following him. The truck suddenly swerves out of control and loses power. He attempts to restart it, but Brandon appears in front of him and shouts. He raises the truck off the ground, levitating it in the air before sending it crashing down. Noah's jaw fractures viscerally as Brandon approaches him. Brandon paints another one of his symbols on the earth with his blood as he dies. Brandon arrives home, claiming he was playing soccer the entire time. He describes how he was bullied and how he lost his shirt. That night, Kyle has a nightmare about Tori discovering the baby in the meteor and deciding to adopt him. However, it surprises him as its eyes abruptly light up with lasers. The phone rings, and Kyle and Tori are summoned to the hospital, where Merrily's hospital room. They console her after she explains that Noah was killed. She says that Brandon came to visit beforehand, which concerns Kyle. The next morning, they tell Brandon about Noah, but all he responds is okay. Kyle worries what's going on and accuses Brandon of being present. Tori tries to calm him down, but he becomes even enraged. Brandon suddenly pushes him into the pantry, smashing the doors in the process. Tori sends him away. Later, Kyle finds Brandon's shirt and notices just a little of blood on it, but manages to take away it without him seeing. He apologizes for earlier, but Brandon simply responds okay again. Kyle later tells Tori about his discovery, but she refuses to believe him. Meanwhile, the sheriff examines the accident and discovers similarities between the diagram in the window and what was sketched on the ground. Kyle looks through Brandon's old birthday cards and attempts to soothe Tori that night. The next day, he decides to take Brandon on a hunting adventure. As they leave, the sheriff makes Tori a visit to explain what he discovered with the images. She does not acknowledge them, but he swears he will return. Brandon and Kyle follow some deer trails through the woods, with Kyle allowing Brandon to look ahead. Tori returns home and discovers Brandon's notebook, which contains the same diagram from the window and the road, as well as additional drawings such as his clothing, the glass in the waitress' eye, and other dead people with the phrase "take the world." She panics. Back in the woods, Brandon checks the tracks while Kyle attempts to shoot him. The bullet fires, but only bounces off Brandon's head. He looks surprised as Kyle tries to reload. When he does, Brandon vanishes. Kyle flees in panic, but Brandon, now hooded again, flies around and appears around him. He finally tackles him and makes him sit up. Kyle tries to apologize, but Brandon releases his laser eyes, penetrating his head and killing him. Back at home, Tori frantically calls Kyle but he does not answer. Brandon finally responds, and Tori asks about Kyle's location. Brandon explains that he's gone and that he's coming home. He hangs up and begins flying through the house at high speeds, demolishing it in the process. She calls 911 while he continues to fly over her. The sheriff and his deputy are dispatched when the 911 call is cut short. They arrive to see the house ruined by Brandon's destruction. Tori begins to emerge from the house as the sheriff shouts to her. However, before she can speak with him, Brandon rushes in and rips him to shreds. Tori and the deputy enter the house, panicked. Tori walks upstairs to hide while the deputy cocks her rifle, looking for Brandon. She calls for help. She wanders around the home, and Brandon appears in front of her, then behind her. Tori can hear the noises of his tearing her apart. Brandon looks around for her, and she remains quiet. She exits the window and smashes to the ground. Tori makes her way to the shed, where the meteor is located. She recalls Brandon's fall injury and tears off a meteor fragment. She discovers the waitress's body as she hides the shard and calls Brandon. He arrives, hooded and all, and she confesses that he means everything to her. She approaches to remove his hood, and he looks at her innocently. She is prepared to stab Brandon with the shard as the two embrace. However, he grabs her hand and pushes the shard out. Angered, he flies her several hundred feet into the air. He gives her one more look before dropping her to her death. As he levitates in the air, a coming airliner approaches and the picture goes black. The next day, the wreckage of the plane is seen on the ground, with no survivors. Kyle and Tori are said to have been inside the farmhouse when the plane crashed. Brandon sits there, eating a cookie with an innocent expression. In the closing scenes, we see millions of people dying at Brandon's hands and cities being destroyed.